everybody else is in bed having their breakfast in bed, I guess, or being serving breakfast in bed. But I'm glad to be here. I'm Joanna Kline. I think you know me. And this is our second week on Judges 2 out of 3. Week 2 out of 3. And today we're going to look at a big section in the middle of the book on Gideon, Gideon's son Abimelech, and then Jephthah. So 2 judges bracketing what turns out to be a very bad king in the middle of it. So why don't I open us up with a prayer. God, thank you for bringing us together on this Mother's Day. Thank you for our mothers and our children. Help us to be able to love and to feel love today, even for those who've experienced losses around Mother's Day. Please be with us as we look at the book of Judges, as we think about how it applies to our lives and our world. Please help us to, especially to think about things that we do in our lives that make for conflict and ways that we can be peacemakers in the world. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so I was told to speak more slowly this time by more than one person, so I'm working on that, but if I'm speaking too quickly, give me a sign, hey, something slow, I don't know, something, I'll be looking out. So I'll try to be more slow. Is the volume okay on the mic? Okay. So my plan for today is to do a bit of review from last week for those of you who were here, and for those of you who weren't here, just review a couple points that we talked about last week. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about overall about violence in the book, because that came up a lot last week. So just kind of frame that for us, and that'll be an important part of the text that we're looking at today. And then we'll take a look at some passages from Gideon, Abimelech, and Jephthah, the stories about them. This is a huge amount of text, so we're not going to cover everything. I'm going to look at some key moments that kind of fit certain themes that I'm looking at. So here's our review of week 1. I've got a map here this time also to help you out. So the book of Judges, it comes after the book of Joshua, so after the Israelites have been wandering in the wilderness and they come into the land. They're settling in the land, and at this point Joshua dies at the beginning of the book, and then they have these series of leaders of judges. The book presents the judges as kind of ruling sequentially, but probably there was some overlap, and they didn't all rule, one at a time. They were probably more of local leaders for the most part, and what we see them primarily do is military endeavors. So they're leaders in some sense, but what the book focuses on is, for most of them, their military leadership and saving Israel from their enemies. We do have one judge who's actually judging disputes that we see in the book. That's Deborah, who we talked about last week. But most of them are military leaders, or just warriors off on their own, like Samson. I'm trying to focus in this series on this pair of themes, retribution and redemption. So the retribution theme is this idea of measure for measure punishment that we see a lot in the book. We see it play out on a human level. We see it play out on a divine level. Sometimes it's a kind of positive movement towards justice. Sometimes it's a negative movement towards revenge. So we'll see both of those examples. And then on the redemption side, this focus on God working through people, a lot of times unlikely people on the margins, unexpected heroes in the book, who are most of them very flawed people as well, that God is working with. So last week we looked at the first 3 of the major judges. There's 12 judges, and 6 of them are considered major judges. Othniel is not very major, but he's considered a major judge. He's the first judge. We don't hear a lot about him just right away in chapter 3, but he becomes this kind of model, just this little short narrative that is a model for how all the narratives, in a sense, play out. This cycle of Israel's disobedience, oppression by their enemies, crying out to God, and then God saves them. And we saw also the story in chapter 3 of Ehud. Ehud is a left-handed Benjaminite, and Benjamin means son of the right hand. So he's a left-handed son of the right hand, which is kind of ironic. He's also a kind of trickster. He goes to the Moabite king Eglon and says he has a secret message from God for him, and Eglon probably thinks he's getting some divine oracle that confirms his kingship, and what he gets is a sword to his belly, and Eglon escapes while the servants are dithering around in embarrassment, waiting for their lord to stop using the bathroom, but he's actually dead. And then we saw the story of Deborah. Unlike the male leaders in the book, Deborah's an established leader. She doesn't have the Spirit of God rush upon her because she's a prophet. She's already in this relationship, with this close relationship with God, conveying God's messages to the people. She sits at her oak. Is it an oak? Oak of Deborah? No, palm of Deborah. She has her own tree. It's a palm, I think. She sits there and judges disputes. People come to her for judgment. Yes, it's a palm. And so she's already known as a wise leader. She goes into battle with Barak, and then unexpectedly, the person who kind of turns out to be another hero of the story is another woman, Yael, who is a non-Israelite woman who lures Sisera, the enemy commander, into her tent. Kind of like Ehud, tricks him into thinking that he's safe, and then when he's asleep, puts a tent peg through his temple, and he's dead. That's where we left off last time. So as we go on this time, we'll be looking at Gideon. He's the next major judge. Then his son Abimelech, who becomes a king, a very bad king. And then Jephthah, who is the next judge. So it's kind of a turning point in the book. If you thought what we looked at last time was bad, things take even a turn for the worse in this section of the book. And on that note, I just want to say a few words about violence in the book of Judges, another gem of a picture of Yael killing Sisera here. So I wanted to just say a few words because this came up in a lot of questions last week, and so I just want to give us some thoughts, I hope, that will help us kind of process what this violence in the book is doing and how we can think about it. I can't give any kind of, final answers or clear up all problems about violence in the Bible here, but I just want to give us some thoughts to think about. When we're talking about this book in particular, as opposed to, say, Joshua or Deuteronomy, what we're dealing with is, Israel is living in the land. They have lots of conflicts with these neighboring people. We talked last time about how you don't have these big enemies appearing in this book like the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians. It's these local skirmishes with neighboring people. But the book doesn't, in the book of Judges, we never have this idea stated that the Israelites are supposed to wipe everyone out. These people groups that they're fighting with, like the Moabites and the Ammonites and the Midianites and the Philistines, these are not people groups who are ever said to be, God never tells the Israelites to wipe these people out in this book or any other books. So we're not really dealing with a kind of holy war thing in this book. It's more of just a difficult, messy, on the ground, violent situations, and the Israelites are being oppressed by all these other people, and the judges are kind of saving them from that oppression. So they're not supposed to be wiping out these people groups in the book of Judges, but they are coming into conflict with them.
Joanna?
Yes?
I don't want to interrupt the flow, but there is a bit of a perception, including through what's happened after October 7th,
Yeah.
that there is a biblical remix towards ethnic cleansing and genocide.
Yeah.
Can you just summarize why that is false beyond what you just said, not just in Judges, but more broadly? Because there are a lot of bad-ites who are cited.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Again, you've opened up a huge can of worms for me to address. And yes, so, that is an idea that isn't completely false about the Bible. There are places in the Bible in especially Deuteronomy and Joshua, where God does tell people to wipe out certain groups of people. And it probably doesn't help that, the Amalekites are one of those groups going back to Exodus, and Netanyahu has used the language about the Amalekites to talk about the present conflict. So I think there is something to that idea that people see this kind of thing coming from the Bible. I would say that, last week and this week, I was trying to move a little bit away from the whole Canaanite problem, because it's just a bigger thing than what I want to address here. But I do think it's how it's depicted in the Bible. For one thing, we tend to think of it in terms of like genocide and ethnic cleansing, but I think the Bible troubles that idea in itself, because you have, for example, the example of Rahab. Right when the people come into the land, Rahab is this Canaanite prostitute who helps them, and she's saved from Jericho, and her family is saved, and she becomes part of the Israelites. And then very soon after that, you have an Israelite named Achan, who he disobeys God by taking some of these things, the plunder that's supposed to be devoted to God. He takes it instead of destroying it, and he and his family end up killed, under stones, kind of like the Canaanites are supposed to end up. The whole thing is troubling, but I think the point I'm trying to make is that right off the bat in Joshua, you get this example of a Canaanite who is kind of becomes one of the Israelites and follows God and kind of sees God's work and joins with the Israelites. And then you have someone who should have been a kind of model Israelite from the tribe of Judah who ends up just like the Canaanites. So I think even the book of Joshua is trying to show us that this isn't about ethnicity. It's not so straightforwardly about ethnicity or genocide or something like that. It's about, obedience or disobedience to God. Also, I think notable in Joshua is the appearance of the commander of the Lord's army. Joshua meets the commander of the Lord's army, who's this, some kind of divine figure. And Joshua says, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" And the commander says, "No, I'm the commander of the Lord's army. Like, I'm not for you, and I'm not for the enemies." The commander of the Lord's army isn't on somebody's side. And so there's a lot, I think, that we still could try to wrestle with and work through with the book of Joshua. But I think it gives us enough clues that this isn't supposed to be, whatever it is, it's not supposed to be a mandate for ethnic cleansing or genocide. And it also is portrayed as a limited, a limited event in Israel's history that doesn't extend to their relationship with all nations. So, like I said, it concerns these 7 Canaanite nations, which I think, as I kind of hinted at last time, may already be kind of extra historical or something. Like, not that they're not historical, but they also kind of symbolize something greater than just a literal reality of the people and the kind of possibility for the Israelites to go astray. But there's lots of other nations around them that ideally they're supposed to make peace with. There's rules about making peace and kind of offering terms of peace already in Deuteronomy. And these nations all around Israel, the Philistines, the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Midianites, all of these are not ever supposed to be wiped out. That kind of mandate is never given in the Bible. And you also get lots of encouragements in, Leviticus and elsewhere to, for example, in Leviticus, love the stranger as yourself, love the sojourner as yourself. So I think there are many troubling texts that do lead people to think that the Bible gives this kind of mandate, but there's also things that upset that kind of, or complicate that kind of picture and show us that it's not that straightforward. And also, that even if you take it pretty straightforwardly, what happens in Joshua, it's never supposed to be something that's necessarily applied to other situations in Israel's history and their relationship with other nations.
Thank you.
Yes.
You may have already mentioned this, but also one of the figures in that time period that was held in highest esteem is Melchizedek, who is not Jewish, was not Israeli. and he's the priest of the Most High God, Elion, which is
Right.
actually a Canaanite word.
Yeah, and right from the beginning of the Bible, the whole Old Testament is framed in a universal kind of framework, and there's always concern for God to work with all people. So even though God does have a very special relationship with Israel in the Bible, that you can argue, I think, that it extends to today.
Yeah, so
but
thanks to Israel.
but it's also a kind of universal view from the start too. Okay, so back to Judges. In the book of Judges, I think this is how I see it: that violence is sometimes depicted as a kind of necessary evil to bring about justice. It's not the ideal picture, but in a story like Ehud, where he kills the king, or where Deborah and Yael take out the commander of the commander Sisera. It's the Israelites have been oppressed sometimes for years and decades under these rulers, and so in this situation that already is a very violent and messy situation, sometimes violence does seem to be depicted as the kind of best case scenario in this particular instance. I also think though that the book doesn't present violence as the only option or the only way. So we'll look at a couple instances today, I hope, where the book presents a kind of de-escalation of violence and diplomacy as positive. So it points the way towards solutions that aren't violent as better than the solutions that are violent. As the book goes on, we do get this kind of increasing violence, especially intra-Israelite violence. And this is, I think, it's not glorified, it's used to show the moral degradation of the Israelites during this time period. And so it's not that, the book is violent, it is violent, but it's not a pro-violence book. And the violence shows this very sad situation, and how when people make bad choices and when they choose bad leaders, all of that can come back to them in spades, and they reap what they sow. In terms of their violence. So that's just a few things I think to kind of frame how we think about violence in this book. I hope it's helpful as we look at these next stories about Gideon and Abimelech and Jephthah. All right, so Gideon, we're going to take a look at his story first. This is a picture from the Brick Testament, Brick Bible, if you've never looked at this website. It's very funny and a bit irreverent Bible in Legos. Anyway, Gideon is... if you have heard this story before, he's a fearful, reluctant leader. So God calls him. He feels like many leaders in the Bible, like Moses, Jeremiah. He feels like he's not ready to be a leader. He's afraid. God asks him to to take down his father's altar to Baal, and he does it, but he does it at night because he's scared. And then God calls him into this battle with the Midianites. But he's scared about that. He asks God for a sign, and that's where the famous sign of the fleece comes in. So the fleece, he lays out this fleece, and he says if it's wet in the morning and the ground is dry, then that's the sign from God that they'll be victorious. And that happens, but that isn't enough for him, so he asks the fleece to be dry and the ground to be wet. But God works with him through his weakness, and God kind of lets him ask for these signs. And God continues to work as they are going into battle. God also reduces his army to 300 men from thousands of people, because God is showing that it's not about Gideon, it's not about the people's own military might, but it's about God working through them. And then God even lets Gideon overhear this dream that one of the Midianites had, and they go down to the Midianite camp, and the guy's telling his friend about this dream he had, where this giant barley loaf rolls in and crushes a tent and rolls on its way. And interesting, because they've had these agricultural conflicts. It says that Gideon was like hiding grain so the Midianites couldn't get it. And now the grain comes and smashes the tent, and the Midianite's friend interprets the dream and says, this dream means that Gideon and his men are gonna conquer us. So Gideon even gets to hear this dream interpreted by a Midianite that the Midianites are gonna fail. And so God continues to work with him in his weakness. And I think we can think too of, where do we need God to work with us in our weakness? And we don't need to feel bad about asking God to meet us in those places. So the Israelites, they defeat the Midianites with 300 men, and they're just blowing trumpets and smashing jars. And it says in this verse, chapter 7, verse 22, it says, when the 300 horns were sounded, the Lord turned every man's sword against his fellow throughout the camp. So all the Midianites are turning their swords on each other, and the Israelites aren't even fighting them. They're fighting each other. And to me, it kind of looks like, this oppressive nation who's been oppressing the Israelites for years, their violence is now kind of turned in and destroying them, which is unfortunately kind of something that happens to the Israelites later in the book. But in this instance, the Midianites are destroyed by their own violence, and the Israelites aren't even fighting them. But they do pursue after these two generals of the Midianites, so they're running after the generals. And at that point, Gideon calls out the Ephraimites, and I was going to point out some things on the map. So I'll go back to that map for a second. Oops. Okay, so this is where Gideon is, up here, active up here. And this is where the tribe of Ephraim is over here. We'll see them play a role a couple times. Eventually, we're going to look at Jephthah, and Jephthah is in this region called Gilead, which is on the east side of the Jordan. So this is the Jordan River, and it plays a role in some of these narratives. So like in Ehud's story, the Ephraimites who live here were called up to help Ehud defeat the Moabites, and they defeated the Moabites, and it says the Ephraimites kind of held the fords of the Jordan so nobody could pass. Now, Gideon has been battling the Midianites up here, and when he's chasing the generals, the two Midianite generals, he calls up the Ephraimites, who are here, to help him out, make sure that the generals don't get away. And so the Ephraimites are the ones who eventually get the generals. And then this is what happens. So the Ephraimites are responsible for killing these Midianite generals, but they weren't called up initially to fight in the war. And they don't like that. So they come and they confront Gideon, and here's the text. It says, "Why have you treated us like this? Why didn't you call us when you went to fight Midian?" And maybe they want the glory, maybe they want the plunder, but for whatever reason they're upset that they didn't get called up initially to fight, which wouldn't have really made sense because they weren't even in the region of the Ephraimites at that time. He's kind of calling them for backup as the generals are fleeing. But Gideon, so they challenge Gideon on this, and Gideon diffuses this whole situation with a kind word. So he says, he answered them, "What have I accomplished compared to you? Aren't the gleanings of Ephraim's grapes better than the full grape harvest of Abiezer?" Abiezer is the clan name that Gideon is from. It's a clan in the tribe of Manasseh. And so that refers to Gideon and his group. "God gave Oreb and Zeev, the Midianite generals, into your hands. What was I able to do compared to you?" At this, their resentment against him subsided. So they come to him. They're all upset. He says, you actually did something way better than me. When he's talking about the gleaning of the grapes, better than the grape harvest, he's saying something like, your mopping up operation was even better than like the main military operation. I didn't even do anything compared to what you accomplished. And so through his own kind of humility, he diffuses this conflict, whereas he could have just said, like, "Why would I have called you up? You're not even live around here. Like, they didn't have any necessarily claim to be called up to this battle. But he doesn't point that out. He diffuses the situation. He just de-escalates it. Everybody goes home, and they're fine. Which will be a big contrast to a very similar situation that happens in the reign of Jephthah. So this is one of those instances, I think, that we see that, using words to de-escalate a situation and make sure that it doesn't turn into violence is held up as a positive thing that Gideon does. And then at the end of the book, unfortunately, Gideon's story ends with him. So he at the beginning of his story, he destroys his father's altar to Baal. But at the end of the book, he ends up setting up something that turns out to be an idol. Whether he made it to be an idol or not is hard to say. This text is on your handout in the first, this first paragraph on your handout. Maybe we won't read this whole thing because of time, but I will just point out a couple things from the text. So at the beginning of this text, the Israelites say to Gideon, "Rule over us, you, your son, and your grandson, because you have saved us from the hand of Midian." But Gideon told them, "I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." This overall seems like a positive thing. So, they ask him to be the king. He already is a leader, but all along in the Bible, the ideal is always that God is the king. You also have human kings playing important roles, and seems to be kind of part of God's plan. But the ideal is always that God is king. And so Gideon, Gideon won't take leadership, kind of away from God. He kind of seems to stay in his place and keep God as the ultimate king. So that seems positive. But then, right after that, he asks the people to give an earring from and all the precious gold and things like that, ornaments and stuff from the plunder, from the battle that they just went through. And then he takes all the gold, and in the last verse it says he makes it into an ephod, which is hard to say exactly what this is. In some places in the Bible, an ephod is a priestly garment, and sometimes it's the garment that the priest wears that has this special thing called the Urim and Tumim, another thing nobody knows what it is, but used for divination or like determining God's will, some kind of dice maybe. But sometimes, like in the David story, sometimes they say, bring the ephod, and they're trying to get an answer from God using an ephod. It may not be a garment in that case, it may be an object. At any rate, it's hard to, this doesn't seem like a garment because it seems to be made all of metal, of gold. But at any rate, he sets up something. We can't say for sure that it's supposed to be something that's supposed to be worshipped. Maybe it's just a monument. Maybe he set it up in honor of God, the true God, Yahweh. We don't really know. But at any rate, it does lead people astray. And the whole thing is kind of, has these echoes of Aaron and the golden calf. And that phrase, earrings of gold, only occurs in that same form in that story of the golden calf. And so, whether Gideon has bad motives here or not, it's hard to tell. But right after this point where he says something positive, I won't be king, then he seems to go on and do something at least a little bit shady. And this is the first time in the book that a judge is the one who's really responsible for leading the people into idolatry. Before, it was always the influence of other nations around them. Now it's the judge himself that is leading people into idolatry. And so they have this time of peace at the end of Gideon's reign, which is not here on the handout, but it says that the land was tranquil for 40 years. The land was at peace for 40 years. And Gideon, it mentions that he has 70 sons, and then he dies. And then we go on to this story about his son Abimelech in the next chapter. And so Abimelech is not a judge. He's a son of Gideon. A little bit curiously, his name, the name Abimelech, means my father is king, which is very strange because Gideon says, I won't be king, and then he names his son, my father is king. Was there some little, kind of hope that he actually did have for some kind of dynasty coming from his family? It's not quite clear, but at any rate, his son, Abimelech, the name means my father is king. And the whole story in chapter 9 here is about Abimelech becoming king. And it's kind of, I think, a meditation on leadership. And people, when people choose bad leaders, bad things happen. So, trying to decide how much we should read of this. I have some excerpts from the beginning and the end of the story, and this measure for measure theme is just hugely prominent in this story, more than probably any other place in the book of Judges. We'll read the first paragraph. I'll say some things about that, and then we'll see where we're at. Okay, so we have Abimelech. He's the son of Jerubbaal, which is another name for Gideon. He went to his mother's brothers in Shechem. That's in the central, kind of right in the center of the Israelite territory. and said to them and to all his mother's clan, "Ask all the citizens of Shechem, which is better for you, to have all 70 of Jerubbaal's sons rule over you, or just one man? Remember, I'm your flesh and blood." When the brothers repeated all this to the citizens of Shechem, they were inclined to follow Abimelech, for they said, "He's related to us. He's our brother." They gave him 70 shekels of silver from the temple of Baal-Berith, and Abimelech used it to hire reckless scoundrels who became his followers. He went to his father's home in Ophrah, and on one stone murdered his 70 brothers, the sons of Jerubbaal. But Jotham, the youngest son of Jerubbaal, escaped by hiding. Then all the citizens of Shechem and Beit Millo gathered beside the great tree at the pillar in Shechem to crown Abimelech king. All right, so you've got this bad situation. This is actually the first king that we have in Israel. We usually think of the first king as King Saul, who shows up in the book of Samuel. And Abimelech, really, he's not probably really the king of all Israel. He's probably really a kind of king of just this city-state in Shechem. But interesting that he is the first Israelite who's called a king. He gets this kingship by appealing to the people, saying, you know, I'm a closer relative of yours, I guess, than the rest of these 70 sons who are, you know, all by, or many by different mothers probably. And they like him because he's kin, he's like them, just, you know, as today, we like rulers that we can relate to, or they seem, you know, like us, they have our best interests at heart, or something like that. And so they use this money from this temple of Baal-Berith, which means Baal of the covenant, so some, you know, and Baal is this Canaanite god. They use this, they give him the money, he uses it to hire, to surround himself with bad people, reckless scoundrels. So, you know, he's surrounding himself already with bad guys. He goes and he kills all of his brothers, except for one who escapes, on one stone, which is a very strange locution, and it'll be significant as the story goes on. He kills them all on one stone, and even after that, the people make him king. So yeah, this is the guy that we want to be our king. And as you can imagine, it doesn't turn out very, very good. Why don't I have? So the next part of this is Jotham's fable. It's often called. Jotham is the surviving son. And so why don't you read this with somebody sitting around you, this last paragraph on the handout, and then the first paragraph on the top, so these two, and just see what you think it's saying about leadership, about kingship. What is Jotham trying to say in this, or what is the message of the parable? So go ahead and read it with somebody sitting around you.
Hold on just a second. Control my hearing aid here so I can actually hear you. All right, go ahead.
Jonathan, if you want a partner.
Okay. We didn't discuss it.
Once you've done reading it, you can talk to someone around you about what do you think it means? What's the parable all about? take another minute and then we'll talk about it together. All right, let's talk about this together. What are your first thoughts or reactions?
Just wanted to know what the name Jerubbaal means.
Oh, it means may Baal contend. And it comes from the beginning of the story, this part we didn't look at, but when Gideon breaks down his father's altar in Judges 6, it's an altar to Baal. And then the people in the town are mad when they wake up in the morning. And they are mad that the altar came down, and so they say to Gideon's father, bring out your son, he has to die for tearing down this altar. And then Gideon's father says, do you have to contend for Baal? Do you have to vindicate him? Whoever fights his battles shall be dead by morning. If he is a god, let him fight his own battles, for his altar had been torn down. That day they named him Jerubbaal, meaning let Baal contend with him, since he's torn down his altar. So it means Baal will contend, or Baal contends. Like Baal, probably, then originally the name would mean like, Baal contends, fights for somebody. But this is like, they name him that according to the story because he tore down Baal's altar, and then they say like, well, if Baal has a problem with it, Baal will take it up with him.
So what we were going to say is
Yeah.
that all of these leaders are clearly flawed, including Gideon, who
Yeah.
creates this idol.
Yeah.
Whether he meant to or not, he
Yeah.
does. So the upshot is that there is no leader who's pure.
Mm-hmm.
That and like Gideon says, I'm not going to be your king because you already have a king, God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, all the leaders are flawed, but some are more flawed than others in this very place.
But it seems a curious name,
Yeah.
in as much that just like his son's name, Abimelech,
Yeah.
in as much as he may at one point be named that as a kind of compliment to his defiance of Baal's draw,
Right.
but ultimately he seems to fall victim
Yeah.
to that same draw.
Right, and it is a Baal name, just like in a lot of names in Israel are either have Yah in them for Yahweh, like Jehoshaphat, like all those names that start with J, for most of the part, is a Yahwistic name, and if it has an L in the name, like Elijah, or Abimelech, or something like that, those have El for Elohim. So people are named after their gods, usually, and he does have a Baal name, which is, side note, when this story is referenced in 2 Samuel 11, in the story of David and Bathsheba, and it mentions Abimelech, son of Jerubbaal, but in the Samuel tradition, any name with Baal in it is changed to Boshet, which means shame. So like Mephibosheth, and there's the other, there's one more. Anyway, anyone with a Baal name is changed to, instead of having Baal in their name, it's changed to shame in that manuscript tradition, and that's what it says. Jerubbaal means like it replaces Baal with shame. Anyway, so it must have been seen as a negative name in the tradition going forward. Yeah.
And also the fact that the 300 men defeat the Midianites not because of their great valor,
Yeah.
but because God gives the victory to them.
Yeah.
So even there you have this kind of example where the credit can't be given to the king or to the leader or
Yeah.
to the people.
Yeah. Any reactions to the fable? Yes, Becky? Or to the story?
Oh, I was just wondering, Gideon doesn't want to be king,
Yeah,
nor does he want his sons to be king.
right.
Does that mean the ruling structure is the judges?
Yeah, I mean, the judges don't seem to have any dynastic leadership. They're rulers usually because God's Spirit comes upon them. God kind of chooses them. And you don't get, at least in Israel, like a dynastic succession until the kings. But although, like, there is a hint that even maybe judges would have liked some of their sons to be continue to be judges, because when you get to the book of Samuel, Eli, he's a priest, but he's also says he judges Israel. His sons are bad, and God like rejects their family from continuing to have authority. And then Samuel is the last judge, and the people say, we don't want your sons to rule over us because they're bad guys. And so it's almost as if this, like, the office of the judge is starting to maybe get dynastic, but God, like, kind of puts that to a stop before it even happens, maybe.
It does not seem to be depending on the title, whether it's a judge or a king. The leadership is effective when the leader listens to God and does what is required by God. And then here we have Abimelech just basically ignores what God commands him to do, and he suffers.
Yeah, that's a great point. That there's not one office that always works. Like, you know, judges can be bad and good. Kings can be bad and good, as we see in Israel's history. So it's not really the office; it's the individual more than the office. That's good.
Any leader, really.
Right.
Independent of the title.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, just the text, the parable. It's a little bit hard to untangle the parable and then Jotham's kind of application of it, but overall, it seems to be just a kind of idea that if you have a bad leader, if you choose the bramble as your leader, there's going to be consequences for that. And interesting to me that, you know, the trees, the olive tree, the fig tree, the ones that are actually producing good, useful fruit have better things to do than be leaders. And so they reject leadership and they go on just serving in their own sphere, which is kind of interesting. But anyway, and I want to be able to move on to the consequences. But what you can see is clearly there's going to be some kind of consequences for their choosing of this leader, and also for their not having been loyal to Gideon's family. That's kind of, Jotham kind of shifts, I think, what the parable is about, to not only be about Abimelech, but about the people's rejection of the people's disloyalty to Gideon's family. Anyway, what happens as this plays out, as the story plays out, is that the Abimelech and the people are all kind of are punished in ways that fit their crimes in a way. So what you see, as I didn't put the whole story here, but it says that in the last part of it, Abimelech governed Israel 3 years, and then God sent an evil spirit between Abimelech and the citizens of Shechem, so they acted treacherously against Abimelech. And so basically how it plays out is the very people that, you know, elected, if you want to say that, chose Abimelech, they ditch him, and they go to somebody else and make somebody else a ruler, and those people go to war against each other. And so Abimelech, he led this kind of conspiracy to overthrow the government of his brothers, and then he himself is overthrown by people conspiring against him as the story goes on. This part is not in the handout, but the people set ambushes against him, and then he sets ambushes against them. They're going back kind of in equal measure. And then, you know, at the beginning of the story that we saw, that the leaders, they give money from their temple of Baal to Abimelech. He hires the people who help him kill his brothers. And then Abimelech comes along, and they're hiding in the stronghold that seems to be attached to the same temple, and he burns it down. And so all these people who had originally chosen Abimelech and paid him money out of this temple that he uses to kill his brothers, then they're trying to hide out there from him after things have gone sour, and he comes with these branches and burns it all down, which is interesting because they talk about the fire coming out of the bramble. He literally is like burning them all up. And then he goes to this other city. This is in the last paragraph. He goes to the city, this other city. He goes to the tower, and in verse 53, this is on your handout, it says one woman, which probably means like a certain woman, but it's interesting that it uses the word one. One woman dropped an upper millstone on his head and cracked his skull. So it's interesting that he killed all his brothers on one stone, which is a very strange phrase to say it like that. And then one woman kills him with a stone at the end. So he, and the word head is also repeated in this, in the sense of leadership. It's a kind of key word, head. But then he gets killed on his head, stoned to his head. Although he tries to cover up the fact that he got killed by a woman by having his armor bearer kill him. But also interesting in the text I said that I referenced before about when this comes up in the context of David, Joab says, you know, if David says to you, why did you go near the wall? Didn't Abimelech get killed by? Didn't a woman strike Abimelech down when he went close to the wall? That's how he's remembered. He's remembered as a woman killing him, even though he tried to avoid that in his memory. At any rate, he gets killed with a stone on his head, and then you get another of these statements from the narrator at the end about God repaying the wickedness of Abimelech. It's actually very rare in biblical narrative that the narrator tells you something like this. Usually, there's a kind of there's often a kind of measure for measure retribution or punishment that plays out in a narrative that the narrator doesn't tell you explicitly is what's going on. But for example, Jacob, back in Genesis, Jacob tricks his father into giving him his blessing. He pretends to be his older brother Esau. He tricks his father. He deceives his father. His father can't see well. Tricks his father, gets the blessing, runs off with it. And then he works for his uncle Laban in order to marry Rachel. And on his wedding night, after 7 years of work, Laban, in the dark, when Jacob can't see right, switches the younger for the older. And when Jacob says to Laban in the morning, hey, why did you do that to me? Laban says, we don't do that around here to put the younger over the older. And it seems like Jacob is kind of getting his just desserts. He deceived his father when his father couldn't see, and it did a switch of the older for the younger. Now Laban switches the younger for the older. At any rate, the narrator doesn't tell you that outright, that that's going on. But here, actually, the narrator does tell you, which is kind of interesting. And one last point about this is that the last verse says, God made all the evil of the people of Shechem fall back on their heads. So in the verse 23, it says God sent an evil spirit between them, which is kind of troubling. Like, why would God send an evil spirit? How could an evil spirit come from God? But then it says God made the evil of the people of Shechem fall back on their heads. And I think there's maybe a hint here that maybe this evil spirit isn't just some kind of a demon or an external evil spirit, but it's their own evil that is coming to kind of fruition in coming back on them. They chose a bad leader, a leader who was a murderer and killing people. Now they're killed by that leader, and the leader himself is killed. And so everybody who's in this messy situation ends up getting this kind of retribution. Their own evil comes back on their head. It happens to Abimelech, and it happens to the people who chose the bad leader. So the whole thing, I think, is this reflection on leadership and a kind of consequences for choosing bad leaders, consequences of people's behavior. All right, I want to make sure I hit a couple points about Jephthah because there's interesting parallel to what happened with Gideon and the Ephraimites. Jephthah is a judge who's even more kind of on the margins than some of them. So he's the son of a prostitute, and so his brothers drive him out. So he's kind of an illegitimate child. He's driven out of his community. And so again, God is choosing somebody kind of from the margins, an unexpected hero, to save the people. And eventually they bring him back. When they're in trouble, they call him back in to help. they're being oppressed by the Ammonites, and here's this instance of attempted diplomacy that I think is held up as a positive thing. He goes to the Ammonites, and instead of just going and fighting them, and they're the aggressors in this situation, but he goes to them and says, "Why are you fighting?" They say, "You took our territory," and then he tells them this whole story about Israel's history and how Israel didn't actually take their territory. So he says, he's kind of just trying to explain the situation, and he says, we don't need to fight this war. He actually says, "You'll possess whatever land Chemosh, your God, lets you possess, and we'll possess the land that Yahweh, our God, has given us." So he's kind of like, just, stick with the land that your God has given you. And if they would have said, "Okay, yeah," and gone home, the war could have been avoided. So it's an example, I think, of where there could have been violence avoided. But they don't listen to him. They go to war with him. He's victorious in the battle, but he makes this rash vow. This is probably the most famous thing about Jephthah. He vows that if he's victorious when he comes back from battle, he'll offer the first thing that comes through his house as an offering to God. And when he comes home, it's his only child, his daughter, who comes out to greet him, and so it seems that he sacrifices her. Some people, the language is a little bit vague at the end, and some people think he may have offered her more like committed to her to almost like the life of a nun or something, even though that's anachronistic. But there's all this emphasis on her virginity, so maybe he kind of committed her to service, some kind of religious service that involved her not getting married. But the most straightforward reading is that he actually did offer her as a sacrifice, which is like the kind of one of the key sins of the Canaanites is child sacrifice, and so now you have an Israelite sacrificing their child. And then what I want to make sure to hit in the last couple minutes is that instead of avoiding conflict with the Ephraimites like Gideon did, he has basically the same situation happen in chapter 12 as what happened with Gideon, but he just stokes the fires of the conflict. Again, the Ephraimites come and they're like, "Why didn't you call us to battle?" And he actually says, "I did call you." We don't have time to read this whole thing. He says, "I did call you into battle, and you didn't come to help," which is not mentioned in the narrative. And then what happens basically is that he fights with the people of Gilead. So instead of he stirs up this conflict more than it needed to be. Instead of Gideon, who calmed it down, he stirs it up. He goes to battle with them, and then in the Gileadites, so remember they're on the east side of the Jordan, they start controlling the fords of the Jordan where people would cross. And whenever someone tries to cross the territory, they make them say Shibboleth, which means ear of corn, or some people say river, but usually in the Bible they say it's ear of corn. And the Ephraimites have some kind of different dialect or different pronunciation. They say Sibboleth, and if they say Sibboleth, then the Gileadites kill them. And so now it says that they killed 42,000 Ephraimites this way, and this is an Israelite tribe. This is an intra-Israelite conflict. And one resource that I've used pointed out that if you add up all the foreign casualties in the book that are explicitly mentioned of Israelites versus non-Israelites, the total is like 15,000 people. And Jephthah, so the Israelites in these different conflicts are said to have killed 15,000 people who are non-Israelites. But Jephthah here, he's starting this intra-Israelite conflict that kills 42,000 people. There's probably, some kind of hyperbole here, and we don't necessarily need to see that as literal, but the fact is that he started this intra-Israelite war that Gideon, faced with the exact same situation, avoided. And so now the Israelites are turning internal, and it's this real turn for the worse, and when Jephthah dies, for the first time, there's no notice of the land had rest for 40 years, or the land had rest for 80 years. And all the other judges, you see this notice of how long they had peace after the judge died. But here, there's no peace after the judge dies. And the next judge we'll get is Samson. I won't read this, but I'll just recommend it to you since we're out of time. Is this week there was published this article, this essay by Zadie Smith, the novelist, in the New Yorker. It's on the New Yorker website online. Shibboleth, and it's about the language we use in the context of the Israel-Gaza conflict, and how the phrases that we use, like from the river to the sea, Zionist, colonialist, on both sides, marks us out as having a certain position, and kind of that we might be more concerned sometimes to mark ourselves out as belonging to a certain group than we are in actually, peacemaking and dealing with the conflict itself. So I'll just recommend that to you. Just published this week, and very relevant, I think, tie-in with this. So that's it for today. Next week will be Samson and the end of the book. So thank you for all your questions and participation.